Thanks so much for that. So I'm Conor Osthoff. I'm an associate director at SRM. A little bit about the company and what it is we do. We are a global risk and cybersecurity consultancy doing business in 10 different countries. I have Rhiannon and Dixon here with me as well, who's a member of my team and a manager of incident response. The two of us partner up together on a broad range of engagements, everything from traditional ransomware and recovery operations to network intrusions, business email compromise, and everything that falls in between.
Thank you, Conor. As Conor noted, I'm Rhiannon Dixon. I'm an incident response engagement lead and manager at SRM. So a little bit more about what we do at SRM. We provide intelligence, resilience, and response services across our 8 office locations internationally, supporting our global clients. For our intelligence services, we provide intelligence that informs critical decision-making and strategies. We turn information into actionable insight. We provide services including merger and acquisition strategy and due diligence, citizenship and visa support for individuals and organizations, and strategic and corporate intelligence services. For our resilience services, we make organizations more resilient to cybersecurity threats. We identify and resolve emerging threats ahead of time. This is where we provide support like strategy and security transformation roadmaps, assessments against regulatory and governance frameworks like NIST and ISO, and reviewing and building security policies and procedures. Finally, there are our response services, where Conor and I sit. We respond to cyber attacks and organizational crises with urgency and efficiency. We also have a kidnapping, ransom, and extortion team, which specializes in assisting with organizational crises and threats to physical security.
So I think how I'd like to start this off is just to set the stage with the goals of security monitoring. As we go through the presentation here, we'll talk about a lot of different concepts, each of them related, and they're all going to help us build that narrative that we have at the beginning here, which helps us understand the implications of a closed alert as it relates to an actual true positive incident. So here I think we can all agree on the first one, that we would hope that an effective security monitoring program will allow us to identify, block, and prevent threats, so making sure that the logic is there to do these rational things as alerts come across the table. As well, we want to reduce the likelihood of incidents. So great, we've made a detection, we have put some type of detection mechanism or criteria in place that will help us block and prevent threats. And really, what is the goal of that? It's to reduce the likelihood that one of these alerts could result in a true positive incident. Another important topic here is to be able to detect risk-accepted threats. So there is a very common scenario, right, where you need to apply a patch to a critical vulnerability. It could result in some type of downtime for the business. Maybe it's a public-facing device that you use to connect to your internal network. There are a lot of situations here, right, whenever you're talking about a security monitoring program and a vulnerability management program as it plugs into it. So one thing that we want to be able to do is, if we have a vulnerability or a threat that can't be remediated, we want to make sure that we have detection criteria for it. Lastly, another healthy goal of one of these security program options, or topics rather, is to generate metrics. So these metrics will be used for a few different things. They'll be used for alert tuning, alert baselining. They'll be used to determine the amount of time that it's going to take you to respond to certain aspects or elements of a particular detection. And honestly, it'll probably help you get some budget too if you find out that your security team is flooded with alerts and things like that.
All right, so we discussed the goals of a mature security monitoring program. What are some of the types of failures? Now, I hope that for all of you, when you log into your computers in the morning, I hope it doesn't look anything like this, right? I hope it's not dozens of alerts across dozens of platforms and different security tools with no single pane of glass. Unfortunately, that is the reality for many of us working in the security and operations spaces. There will be dozens, hundreds, thousands of different alerts, generating quite a lot of noise throughout the environment. And it's on the security professionals to sort through that noise and determine which of these alerts are actually something that requires action and may be critical to the organization. So I'll quickly walk through these different types and categories of failures. Of course, alert fatigue, which is the topic of this presentation and which we'll be focusing on quite a bit more. There's also inadequate tuning or baselining, which is another failure which heavily leads to alert fatigue. There's also knowledge and training failures. So even if the IT manager, the SOC manager, has a good understanding of how to action certain types of alerts, does every analyst and engineer on the team who's going to be prioritizing these alerts also understand how to respond and which ones are critical? That can lead to knowledge and training failures if they don't have the understanding of responding to those types of alerts. We also see failures relating to a longer dwell time. A longer dwell time can essentially cause security professionals to think, oh, it must be a false positive. It's been in the environment a very long time. If you're seeing alerts, which are taking place over the course of weeks and months from the same tooling, it can be easy to assume it must be business required, it must be business necessary, even if actually it's not. We also see failures around the blocking of grayware. This is particularly because although today's automation tooling, when it's fully deployed across the environment and it's been successfully configured, can often easily weed out the super critical alerts, the easy bads, the ransomware. They can also weed out the very low-level alerts, the easy ones like adware or informational alerts. But then there's the vast array of across the middle criticality alerts, all the way from just a little bit more than low alert to not quite high. Is the team actually confident that those alerts are being prioritized correctly and there aren't some hidden higher critical alerts amongst those that are categorized as mid? We also see configuration failures. If the tool isn't sending all of the data or not sending it in a way that the receiving platform is configured to process, then you don't get the full picture. Finally, we see identity failures. This is simply when there is misidentification and an alert is incorrectly reported by a tool, or it's correctly reported and then misunderstood due to human error.
So we've talked about the goals of an effective security monitoring program. We've also talked about the actual types of failures that are going to be generated inevitably as a result of your program while you're working on perfecting it. Another important thing to frame here is just the material impact, right? So what happens financially speaking and in terms of a time commitment for your organization as well whenever you do have one of these detections that in one way or another fails as a result of those failures on the previous slide. So just looking at the data here, what I can say is the metrics that are provided at the top of the slide here are a mixture of what we have access to internally from the incidents that we respond to at SRM, but that's also paired with some publicly available information from Chubb, who is one of the largest carriers who are going to be actually sourcing a lot of the customers that are unfortunately victims to a lot of these different types of threats. So I think at the top there we have the average claim cost at around $400,000. Obviously, that's important from a dollars and cents perspective, and it helps us to understand and frame just how expensive a lot of these cybersecurity threats are, understanding that there are extremes on both ends of that spectrum. As well, 20 days to rebuild for your average ransomware incident, and some of your larger network intrusions as well for these big companies and big organizations. So while you're sourcing that claims cost and all the things that go into there, right? So incident response services, restoration services, any legal fees and considerations from that level of consulting, all of those go into that $400,000 figure. But as well, you do have all this business interruption time whenever your systems are encrypted, everything's offline, non-operational, and you're trying to get your environment restored and back up and running. Partner that concern with, one, the claims cost, but two, that impact to outage and business service. And then you also have an average loss in 1.5% of the full company value, which really frames just how critical it is to be able to effectively detect threats. I mean, most companies can survive one incident like this, right? As you go from 2, 3, 4, 5 incidents over a 10-year period, that's a very significant difference and a very different conversation that you'd be having at that time as well. So if we take a look at the graph here, what we want to explain is the amount of time that needs to be taken to respond to and remediate a lot of these different incidents once they become an actual incident. So at the bottom here, we have an isolated infection. This would be one system that has in one way or another interacted with a malicious file, and that system itself is compromised. There's not necessarily any additional malicious activity at this point. You're confident it's one system. You've probably quarantined that system at this point. One thing that goes into the costs here is going to be an actual analysis to figure out, I don't think that there was hands-on keyboard activity yet as a result of this, but I need to make sure, I need to do my due diligence to really understand if any data on that system had been accessed, if there were any attempts at lateral movement and things like that. Again, at this point, you don't expect that, which is why it happens to be an isolated infection, but these things still need to occur as a result of that incident response process. Kind of one step up in complexity here, right? We do have command and control. So command and control is kind of what we described previously, but a step further. This would be a system that's infected that you actively see commands being sent to that system with a threat actor behind them, orchestrating their actions on objectives. Usually this is still going to be at an early stage. It wouldn't be what we consider at this point a full-blown network intrusion, right? But they may be doing things like performing reconnaissance commands. They may be seeing what systems exist to their left and right, what they have access to, proving that they have access and really looking at where they can go within your network. Business email compromise is usually relatively small in terms of the fees associated with response efforts, recovery efforts, containment actions. The expensive part here is really who pays the victim or your internal organization if you've actually issued a fraudulent payment or something like that. So sometimes the carrier covers it. Sometimes if you work with law enforcement, you're able to get that transfer reversed. Sometimes you're able to as well get that remediated by working with a combination of these channels, but ultimately sometimes you do get stuck with the bag there, and that can be a very expensive thing as well. Usually this fraud, sometimes it is on the low end of $25,000 to $50,000, but very commonly in the matters that we work, they happen to be $400,000 and up to $800,000 in range. Network intrusion, again, is just that step up in complexity, right? So you've had command and control. Network intrusion is command and control at a larger scale. So you have multiple systems compromised. You have that C2 or that command and control software spread out to a bunch of different systems. That means that large-scale attacks are right on the edge of being orchestrated, which really feeds into those next actions on objectives that we have here that really increases costs. So one thing, network intrusion events usually preface data exfiltration as well as the deployment of ransomware, which you can see here just how much more severe and how much more expensive it is to respond to a ransomware attack, just given how much of your environment is going to need to be rebuilt, and also understanding that threat actors commonly pursue double extortion tactics, meaning that they're going to want to charge you a ransom for the actual decryption of your data. So they're charging for availability or attempting to monetize the availability of your data. We also have them seeking financial gain associated with the exfiltration of data.
All right, so we've seen the goals of the security monitoring program. We've seen the impact when those goals fail to be met. We can take a quick moment to focus on threat actor attribution, the source behind a lot of these ransomware incidents that Conor and I are managing day to day. Let's spend a minute just going right to the source of these different sample of the threat actor groups that are behind the ransomware statistics that we just provided. So we have here Lockbit 3.0, Akira.sexi, Cactus, Medusa, Alfie, and Inc., among many, many other financially motivated threat actor groups. While they're active in environments, these groups typically provide valuable opportunities to remediate the threats before they become a larger issue. With the majority of the threat actors on this slide, they align with Lockbit 3.0's approach, which is to spend time in the environment, often 2 to 3 weeks or more, dwell time in the environment before deploying a ransomware payload, During that time, they're learning the environment, they're escalating privileges, they're gathering the juiciest data to exfiltrate before they deploy that ransomware. The biggest standout to this trend is the .sexi threat actor group. So the .sexi threat actor group does take a different approach. From what we've seen, once gaining access, their goal is to deploy ransomware in under an hour. Their goal is only to encrypt the virtual infrastructure. So that's one group that does have a very markedly different approach. Instead of dwelling in the environment for a very long period of time beforehand, their goal is to gain that access and then deploy ransomware almost immediately and only on the virtual infrastructure. However, the majority of the threat actors on here and the majority of the threat actor groups that we deal with on a daily basis, their tactics, techniques, procedures are markedly different in that they're spending several weeks at a time, which is plenty of time for there to be lots of alerts generated as long as security teams know what to be on the lookout for.
So we talked about who you have to be worried about if you have a misdetection that results in a true positive incident. We've also talked about the material impact of that, right? So talking from a cost perspective. Another important thing to talk about here is going to be common entry vectors. So how we see these threat actors gaining access to the normally restricted environment. It still happens, brute force of accounts, that are single-factor authentication based. There are a lot of small to medium-sized companies that have VPNs that still have single-factor authentication, and MFA hasn't been enrolled or added to that authentication mechanism to provide the additional security. So we do see threat actors still brute forcing their way into networks by compromising accounts in that way. We also see exploited perimeter devices. Usually these are going to be things that provide some form of remote connectivity into your environment. But there are lots of network technologies that are security-based as well, and Palo Alto comes to mind just because of their recent vulnerabilities that they've had, where there are perimeter devices that are vulnerable to things like remote code execution vulnerabilities, where after they've been successfully exploited, the threat actor has effectively hands-on keyboard access to that system and is going to be able to move around your environment and conduct their actions on objectives. The use of compromised credentials, again, we think about phishing most of the time whenever this happens. It could also be a credential reuse situation where they have a compromised password for a personal account that could be used to authenticate to some form of internal infrastructure. So we do still see that frequently. Drive-by download and watering hole attacks are somewhat similar here in the example that they both require web browser interaction and interaction with a web page. Sometimes it's as simple as you meant to click on a product, you accidentally clicked on the advertisement. You're sent on a series of 4 redirects before you go where you actually planned to. Redirect 2, redirect 3, one of them downloads something onto your system. The end user then interacts with it thinking it's a legitimate file, resulting in a command and control or an isolated infection situation. The watering hole attack is a bit more targeted in terms of trust. Usually this will be, I guess if I were to put you into perspective here, you're at your computer, you're going through your web browser, you want to book a cruise, right? You booked it 2 years ago through this provider. The only difference here is that whenever you go to the actual services page, this time there's a download that happens automatically. It is very common that threat actors will compromise a legitimate website, modify the code in the back end to host a malicious file. Whenever you go there or a normal user goes there attempting to buy services, the file will be downloaded. If you interact with the file that's downloaded, you then have a system level compromise. So this has happened in some of our largest incidents that we've worked, which just shows as well that it's still a prevalent tactic for these threat actors to gain access to the internal infrastructure. As well, I honestly really wish I didn't have to bring this one up, but it's been a few years of responding to incidents that were caused by on-prem Exchange, specifically proxy shell. And it's like Microsoft knows that it's a very difficult technology to administrate. If you've ever tried to build an Exchange server, it's probably one of the worst days of your life. It's even worse if you have to rebuild it after it got hosed as a result of an incident. So honestly, what I would say here is make an effective plan to migrate from Exchange on-prem to Exchange online. No, it can't be a hybrid implementation because it's still vulnerable. This will give me a lot more hours of sleep, and I definitely would appreciate that.
Thank you, Connor, and I second that. So in terms of threat actor tooling, we'll speak briefly on the most common tools that we see used by threat actors across these 3 different categories, right? Reconnaissance, post-exploitation, and then, of course, live off the land. So first, in terms of reconnaissance, I'll say that the tools that we see noted here primarily fall into 3 categories of host-based reconnaissance, network, and then identity and access management reconnaissance. Of course, with host-based reconnaissance, it's very important to make sure that security tooling is implemented and will be alerting on these sorts of activities in the reconnaissance stage. It's also important to make sure that there are alerts around if there's network reconnaissance taking place. So if it appears that there's a device in the environment attempting to find out what devices have different IP addresses that can be communicated with. And it's very, very important to not forget identity and access management based reconnaissance, right? If there's tooling in the environment that can find out in Active Directory what types of groups there are, what types of users there are, if there's suspicious activity in terms of new users being added or suddenly having elevation of privileges that aren't expected, it's important to have security tooling that will be alerting on that. In terms of post-exploitation, so what happens next after these common entry vectors? Next is they're continuing their actions on objectives. So with these post-exploitation frameworks, these are tools which are often used by red teams to conduct legitimate penetration testing and vulnerability scanning. However, they're also heavily used by threat actors to exploit moving from one system to another. So if there's an in-house penetration testing team, it's important to know who's on that team, which accounts do they have, which tools are they going to be using, and if there's anything outside of that norm taking place, there should be alerts taking place on that unusual activity. Finally, we have the live off the land category. Threat actors want to reduce their visibility in the environment. If there are tools already present that will further their goals, that's what they're going to use. A lot of threat actor groups do not have a preference between AnyDesk and TeamViewer. They'll simply use what's already in the environment that they know appears to be approved by the business and may not be alerted on. With that, I'll pass it to Conor to speak to each of these tools in a bit more detail.
Definitely, and I think you did a great job of framing it. Really, what I would like to share here is I usually frame it as a pick one type of scenario. So, for example, if you look at live off the land, you see a few different remote access solutions, right? SplashTop, ConnectWise, AnyDesk, TeamViewer. The threat actor might see that you have one of those on the system, and then they'll know that they can use that one. Not every system in your environment is going to have each of those tools or solutions, though, especially if it's a server in your critical infrastructure or it's a low privilege end user workstation. In situations like that, it's very common that they would bring one of these tools in to assist with their persistence so that they can maintain control of that system without having to go in through their means of initial access every time, which is going to save them a lot of time if they can come and go through their own means. So if you happen to be one of the organizations that uses AnyDesk, for example, put detections or blocks in place for TeamViewer, Atira, SplashTop, ConnectWise. Really the same thing goes for everything else. These are very powerful tools that can be used for nefarious purposes if a threat actor has access to your network and they have particular actions on objectives that they want to pursue. Another particularly impactful tool here would happen to be rclone. I know how important it is to a lot of organizations. It really is the best tool at what it does, but I'll also say that 99% of incidents that we've worked out of the hundreds over the last couple of years, one commonality that they all have is when SCP and FileZilla aren't there, or if there's stringent security controls in place that would prevent transfers from where they want to send that data, it's rclone that they bring onto that system. So if you can detect rclone being executed, if you can even detect rclone by file name or hash, that's still going to be really, really helpful at impeding that actual exfiltration objective, knowing just how commonly rclone does happen to be used in these types of incidents. Another important thing here is just to make sure that we frame commonly exploited technology. So I have a lot of vendors listed here, and I don't have any particular favorites. I don't want it to seem like I'm picking on these vendors independently. What it happens to be, and what's closer to the truth behind this slide, is that threat actors prefer to reuse as much code as possible, as much of their procedures as possible. So these aren't so much common culprits as they are common targets. If we think about just how prevalent, Palo Alto is as a brand, for example, it's much easier to justify from a time perspective a threat actor crafting an exploit that they can use across a very broad range of technologies. And that's really why we see it frequently used as a point of initial access, right? So there's a thought here that if you're using a prevalent piece of software, there is a chance that it's already being targeted in a way that could cause you organizational harm. And what I'll also say is that if we pick a couple more off of here, Veeam, for example, this one has a different type of implication, right? Most of the companies that we work with have Veeam backups. Again, it's very great at what it does. The problem comes with insecure storage of those backups. So when threat actors gain access to networks, what do? They harvest credentials. When they harvest credentials, one of the things that they're going to do with those powerful credential sets is delete the backups. They want to make sure that if they're going to encrypt your environment, that you can't rebuild through your own means. If you're able to store these backups off-site and you have it behind a tight lock and key, that's helpful. What we find is that most organizations do not, and it's really as simple as getting those credentials and running a script to delete all of the Veeam backups. So that backup system that you put in place, that you've put all this time into, that you practiced execution of during your change management windows, most of the time we see this solution overcome in just about 20 minutes because we put it in there, we made sure it worked, but we didn't effectively secure it. Another thought that kind of plays into that same area would be Windows Defender or Microsoft Defender, right? Good tool. It's a tool that's getting better as well. It's affordable, which is really great for a lot of organizations. It filters out a lot of the low-level threats that your organization would face. But at this point, it really is just standard practice for threat actor sees Defender. They bring their new flavor of script that they have that disables it. They run it with administrative privileges. They have it disabled across multiple systems. So it is an effective tool, but unfortunately it's targeted so often and it doesn't have proper tamper protection built in yet. So it really does cause challenges to a lot of organizations that they think the tool is designed to help them overcome.
All right, so far, do you feel confident in your ability to detect? At this point, we've described the goals of security monitoring and alerting. We've described the unfortunate reasons why those goals are sometimes not met, the threat actors and the tactics, techniques, and procedures that they use. However, this is only the beginning. In the next portion of our presentation, we'll discuss leading practices for alert baselining to reduce alert fatigue while increasing environment security.
Thanks for that. Yeah, I mean, it wouldn't be a B-Sides presentation if there wasn't a dank meme involved, but back to business. So incident commonalities, what we hope to frame here is really of the situations that we see missed alerts or costly alerts, what is actually playing into those narratives. So the first one here, we have threat killed and quarantined, but the dropper succeeded. The thought behind this is that you've had an end user workstation or a type of system in your environment. It has interacted with malicious code, a piece of malware, whatever that happens to be. Most of the times when this infection happens, it's not straightforward, meaning that it's not all contained in that initial code delivery. It's a multi-phased approach, where the system is going to go from different system level resources first, out to the internet, get what it needs. There's going to be multiple iterations and back and forths before you have that system level compromise. So it's pretty common that a tool that's meant to detect these threats says that a threat was killed and quarantined, when actually it only caught, the final phase of delivery, and really you have another infection going on that prefaced it. So you think that it's been remediated, you haven't put time into figuring out if that's true, and as you do, you realize more and more, like, okay, maybe this system is compromised. So we do see that frequently. As well, backup solutions can be particularly tricky whenever you're trying to make effective detections. One thing that we see commonly, right? I did mention credential harvesting in concept, or at least in principle. One thing that threat actors do, they get access to your domain controller, they dump ntds.dit. That gives them all of the credential sets that they would want to use in your environment. Not in the perfect format, but they at least have hashes for those accounts. As well, we see that backup solutions need to access these highly important files as well, right? So they attempt to access these files so that they can copy them and back them up. That creates a alert for the access to that file in general, which is very loud because it's going to happen on every system every time that you make that backup, or for ntds.dit, an example, just your domain controllers. So that's one thought there, is the loud backup solution actually obscures your ability to make an effective detection for when these sensitive files are being accessed. Curb roasting alerts are another particularly hard one. It's difficult to begin with to write a good detection for finding curb roasting. And the only reason that we need to worry about it, right, is because legacy authentications are being used in the environment. It happens a lot, especially in older companies or companies that have been here a long time and have done many different upgrades. But if an effective goal of a security monitoring program is to identify credential misuse, it's critical that we're able to identify this as well, and it is very, very loud. Baseline configuration sets used to detect command and control. Specifically to this example, what we'd meant here is that a lot of times companies that don't have, a full security engineering team, for example, right? They buy a product, they get some out-of-the-box detections. These detections, they need to be tuned and they need to rotate frequently because it could be a situation, right, where something on a Wednesday shows up as C2 activity. Then you find out 2 days later that the threat actor has refreshed their infrastructure. It's not a command and control server anymore. Now it's a legitimate web page. Every time that this example happens, it creates a false positive alert. You close these alerts day in and day out, and it creates a situation where your senses are kind of dulled, right? You're fatigued from how many of these types of alerts you've had to close. You miss the ones that are actual true positives. And then lastly here, just adding an additional layer of complexity for what we see is actually more of an identity issue. So the use of VPN or data center IP address ranges to conduct these attacks. It's challenging to, generate an alert every time that you see a VPN address or a data center address being used. What we find, though, is that most organizations don't really understand the IP address ranges that they should be blocking for this type of activity, or that they should be allowing for this type of activity.
That brings us to the hero of the day, alert baselining. I will say that we'll walk through this baselining cycle due to the fast pace of change in business operations. Mature baselining is going to have to follow a cycle. It's no longer, perhaps never was, a one and done item. It's something that needs to be done circularly in an ongoing cycle. We'll begin with measuring, understanding and measuring what's normal. This is across traffic, applications, user behavior, everything aligning with what we spoke about earlier in terms of host-based, network-based, and identity and access management-based reconnaissance. We want to make sure that we have a good idea of what is normal in the environment. Each organization is going to have to define the amount of alerts that make sense based on these factors, based on the number of noise generators in the environment, based on the amount of alerts that the organization's security operations team can realistically handle, based on the number of security team members, the amount of automation, and the degree of single pane of glass maturity across the alerting platforms. For a small business with under 100 employees, receiving a critical alert every single week likely means the definition of critical is too broad, or it means that end users need more training. For a very large business with a broader attack surface, a critical alert every week may be par for the course, and the team has plenty of resources to cope with it. That brings us into the define stage of the baselining cycle. Define how many alerts is too many based on the tooling, the resources available in the environment, and how many noise generators there are. That brings us to the educate stage of the baselining cycle. If an alert must be loud, make sure that everyone knows why. This is very, very important. Again, even if the SOC manager or the IT manager has a good understanding of, based on this type of alert, these additional actions need to take place, it's very important that the analysts, the engineers, and all the other members of the security team also have an understanding. If an alert is loud, what actually needs to take place as next steps. A team of 50 people is of course going to be able to handle more alerts than a team of a single person. And a team that's equipped with a single pane of glass alerting platform will be able to handle far more alerts than a team without that capability. So the amount of loud alerts in each environment is going to change based on those factors. Then we get to the collaborate stage of the baselining cycle, which is also very important given the amount of change that's taking place in modern business operations. It's important to collaborate with the business to understand, ideally ahead of time, about when normal is changing. It may be that the business is choosing to migrate from SAP to Oracle. It may be that there's other security tooling in the environment or business tooling which is changing month over month and year over year. It's important to collaborate with the business to understand, because per our earlier examples, if AnyDesk used to be used, but now it isn't, then it's important to set up alerts. Once it's been phased out and it's no longer part of the environment infrastructure, we don't want to just keep it around. And that's something that has to be collaborated on with the business, rather than just determining in a silo what seems to be used and not checking in with the business side. That brings us to the investigate phase of the baselining cycle. This is very important to not rely merely on passive alerting. Even once the organization's baselining has been set up, it's configured, and it's very mature, it's still important to investigate all of the critical and high alerts that are coming through and make sure that team members know how to appropriately respond rather than just letting the alert go by along with all of the others. When starting in protect mode with the tool, first setting up alerting for the higher risk alerts like ransomware and malware will make sense based on the organization's risk appetite. Then trimming the numerous false positive alerts by working with the business to identify those false positives that are alerts for business necessary tooling, and ensuring that those applications, tools, or protocols and traffic destinations are appropriately whitelisted and won't be adding to the security team's load of alerts. Lastly, reviewing the medium alerts over a longer period of time is very important to gain an understanding of the typical mid-threat level alerts that are experienced by the organization. Many advanced security tools can enact an appropriate response for critical risk and low risk alerts once they've been tuned to the environment and are completely deployed, but the mid-risk alerts can take the most time to tune and to baseline. It's also important to remember here throughout the baselining cycle that we're not only talking about alerts coming from inside your environment. Do you subscribe to critical updates from CISA? Do you subscribe to critical updates from your main IT and security vendors? If so, those alerts should also be incorporated into that single pane of glass and into the alert baselining methodology that the organization will use. That brings us to tuning across alert types and the value that's provided based on the criticality level. So as you can see, this graph simply charts the time investment for tuning based on different alert types against the value added. So in that far right-hand corner, we have, of course, the critical alerts. Critical alerts are going to be the highest value add because if they aren't tuned for, then the business is open to the risk of mislabeling a critical alert as low, or in the other direction, weighing down the security team with vast amounts of supposedly critical alerts that are impossible to prioritize and to manage. With the right security tooling and an understanding of the organization's typical baseline and asset management, tuning of critical alerts can be a relatively faster process. It's easy to recognize the absolutely known bads, right? Now we also have false positives on here as the second most value added subset of criticality to focus on. That's because, despite the name, this presentation is not hating on recognizing true false positives and whitelisting them appropriately. Tuning those false positives is the highest value add because when not tuned correctly, false positives are generating massive amounts of noise. If the system is set to protect mode, then false positives can also impede business functionality to the point of the business actually asking the security team to turn off or remove security tooling altogether, which further increases that risk to the business. Therefore, tuning false positives can take a large amount of time, but it's a very high value activity for the security team to conduct as part of the alert baselining. And it does depend on what type of organization you have, how long that false positive tuning will take. Organizations that primarily build software, design graphics, may have more false positives than schools, for example. Organizations with strong asset management will also have a much easier time with tuning for false positives than organizations with lower asset management maturity. I'll also note that tackling the middle level alerts, as we mentioned, it can take additional time compared to the highs and the lows because, again, most security automation tools can recognize the easy highs and the easy lows. So it's the areas in the middle that we often see needing additional manual intervention and some additional categorization and assistance to make sure that they are baselined and prioritized correctly.
All right, with that said, I do have some leading principles here that I can leave you with. I'm not going to go through each of them, considering, we just did to get to this point. But if you need a frame of reference, there it is. What I will say is there's a lot of friendly faces here, so I appreciate you showing up for me and showing support. There's also a lot of new faces, and, I'd like to get to meet everyone. If you have any questions, Rhiannon and I, we're going to be here all day, so we'll be going in and out of the different rooms. We appreciate you showing up for the presentation that we had today. We hope you enjoyed it, and yeah, thanks again. I have to ask you if you have any questions. Jake. So really, so the question there, in case not everybody is able to hear it, is when threat actors are pursuing exfiltration objectives, what types of data are they targeting? So really, it depends on the type of environment that they're in. If it's a financial institution, they're definitely going after the internal finance data as well as the external finance data, so things that they would use for their customers. Most of the times, it's not such a scientific approach. We see that they do perform some file system level reconnaissance that's evident through like shell bags and link file artifacts and stuff like that. Most of the times, yeah, they're just clicking through folders that happen to look appealing to them. Maybe they'll go through the payroll folder, the taxes folder, and then once they find that, they usually back out a few directories, and then they'll try to take everything from that first directory and back. Most of them are volume based, and the thought there, right, is if they have 700 gigabytes of data, there's probably going to be more things that they're willing to pay to incentivize a payment for.
If only you had some honeypot payroll folders.
Yeah, exactly. Adam?
So I realize that most people are dealing with probably just having a first-party SOC. They typically might not have an MDR. When you do have the opportunity to use a third-party service like an MDR, what frequency do you feel is appropriate for doing rule tuning?
So I think that really there should be a roll-up that happens weekly that just shows based on type of alert category and measures how many alerts have been escalated, how many alerts have been detected. I think that it's critical to figure out how much of that noise is actually going to be sifted out before it made its way to your team. So if you find that that number is too high, I think weekly is probably good. I would say in terms of looking at actual true positive remediations and trying to calculate what has been missed versus what has been escalated and what that means for the maturity of the overall program, I think that that should happen monthly at the least.
Awesome. Thank you very. Oh, one more.
Sure.
Thanks. So you mentioned Defender and how there's no tamper protection in a lot of implementations. Do you mostly find that victims are using Defender versus like I guess how many times do you have like a more modern EDR that's catching a lot of those? Like, so for instance, the tool listing that you had, a lot of those, many EDR's worth its salt is going to detect those, and there's also tons of tamper protections, and it requires a much higher skill set to dismantle. How much do you notice like attackers actually going for like dismantling of these EDR tools versus just saying, I'm just going to go for a company that's using Defender or something weaker?
That's true. I would say probably 1 in 20 do we see traditional or conventional EDR that's going to be bested. A lot of times whenever we do have that metric though, it's as we mentioned, right? The tool, they might think that it is, or they don't want a business interruption, but for whatever the reason, they think that their tool is going to be actively protecting against threats or blocking them. Really, it's just detecting them. So not much to overcome there, as you know. As well, it is a large process to bypass like a SentinelOne or a CrowdStrike EDR solution. Most of the times that we see that happen, it's the threat actor going into registry and doing really loud things, right? Deleting values, deleting configurations, actually ripping critical services out of the system. Then it's still not enough, right? Because you have all these critical services running in memory already. Next, they usually force a reboot and the system comes back up in safe mode. So think of like how many opportunities the organization has to detect that. And really the window that they force that reboot has to be perfect. Otherwise, people are going to realize what's happening whenever they have a critical service go down and come back up. And it's not even in a fully operational state, right? It is in safe mode. So yeah, they do usually target victims that are a bit easier. Some of the larger, like Fortune 500, Fortune 100 companies, we have seen EDR bypasses like that used in those particular environments. But yeah, significantly less common.
Thank you so much. Great talk.
Thanks again, everyone.
Lunch is being served in the event center, so if you go back over to the track 2 side, down where it says event center, you'll find the lunch buffets.